Good morning, friends. I'm Mike Trotman. I'm a Presbyterian, retired Presbyterian pastor, resides in the greater St. Louis area, and joined by my good friends, the Reverend Jennifer Long, who's at Spring Hill UCC Church in the state of Florida, who's not retired, and the Reverend Dr. Steve Langford, um, who is a retired Methodist pastor in Arlington, Texas. So today we're bringing you the story of Joseph.
Family relationships, Joseph and his brothers. Our reading begins in Genesis chapter 37 at verse 3. Now Israel, also known as Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because Joseph was the son of his old age. Israel had made Joseph a long robe with sleeves. When his brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to them, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words.
I'm continuing in 37, 26 to 34. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up from the well, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the ornamented robe taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days.
And so a lot happens where I get to the story where Joseph is in Egypt in the position of power. And this is the beginning of the reconciliation. Realizing that their father, that was Jacob, was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong that they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you tended to do harm to me, and God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as God is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. And that ends the Joseph saga in abbreviated form.
Wow.
Okay.
So I was noticing that I often forget, and maybe because whenever I hear anything that has to do with Joseph, the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat runs through my head. I love the show. I know all the music. I was in the show in high school. Our church choir did it. But I often forget that it's not his brothers who sold him.
Yeah.
They just threw him in the well, and then came back and finding him gone, had to figure out what they were going to tell Dad.
Well, actually, the brothers sold him. It was Reuben that found the empty well, according as I read it.
So why didn't Judah just say to Reuben, we got rid of him and here's your cut? I just find this particular part, I'm not sure there's any good theological value in it. I find the intricacies of how we do business interesting.
He was going to
There's
go back
lots.
though and free him before his brothers caught on to what was going on.
Got it.
If that's my remembrance, but geez, that's my sense that he was going to go and get him out of there because he felt guilty for what they had done before his brothers, but then it was already done. So, and I could be totally wrong on that.
Well, I was clearly totally wrong. So looks like I'm down with that.
That sound decent, Steve? At least plausible.
Yeah, 37:22, Reuben said, shed no blood, throw him in a pit, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father later.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Family dynamics.
Yep. As an oldest, I'm down with
Throw him in the pit.
keeping Joseph in his place.
I think that's super interesting. So this is just the detail of the story that I've never remembered, and that Reuben was taking some different kind of responsibility than the rest of them. I mean, that was yes, Mike, I hear what you're saying. Good with putting Joseph in his place, but I don't know that that's what I hear Reuben doing.
No.
What's based
Reuben's
on what?
protecting him.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also saying, okay, throw him in the pit. I get it. He's been a jerk. Like he's
Yeah.
kind of playing. He's trying to be, I don't know, connected with the brothers that want to get rid of this guy, but also feels a responsibility to Joseph. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the reason he was protecting Joseph was to protect his dad. It wasn't out of his care for Joseph. It was out of his care for his dad and his dad's love.
Oh, how many times is our dad the driver of the things we do? That's I'm struck again by how this text captures the human condition again.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when my own two sons had grievances against me, and some of it right and some of it just, the kind of stuff that human beings do in the midst of anxiety in their own lives. If I'm calm enough in the midst of that, I said, well, that's why they have therapists, so you can work this stuff out.
So interesting.
Well, the important thing, number one, is recognizing it. And then number two, being willing to address it with an outside help, i.e. a therapist.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, we just live out of it. And we do this crazy stuff that just keeps inflicting the pain, passing it around and passing it down.
Take one down, pass it around. 98 bottles of beer on the. Sorry. Sorry.
Oh,
It's just.
Was that in the musical?
I wish it was in the musical. It was not in the musical in any way, shape, manner, or form. But
yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say two things. One is that when I think about Joseph, and I know that my perception is shaped by the fact that I too am an oldest. I think of the movie The Lion King, where Zazu is counseling Mufasa very early in the movie. And Mufasa is kind of like, what am I going to do about my brother Scar? And Zazu's response is, every family has one, sire. In mine, there are two. And I love the quote. I think I don't know that there's a human being I've met that couldn't relate with that. Every family has one. Peace. And
That's me.
Oh, is it you?
I'm the identified one in my family.
And what I think is but what I like about the Lion King example too, is I think it gives me an opportunity to say things like, but I think that one is too black and white. I mean, the suggestion in that is Mufasa is good and Scar is bad.
Right.
And I think in the story of Joseph, we get a little bit more of the family dynamic, a little bit more of Reuben's not particularly good or evil, just stuck in this place. Joseph, who I think always gets top billing, is the good one. I don't think either is particularly. I mean, I think this shows him as kind of snotty.
Pain.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was snotty. He was a pain.
But also as one willing to forgive. Yeah, I think to some extent
when he
it's
grew up,
a journey of maturity. Yeah.
Yeah.
When he grew up. Yep.
Sorry, Mike, I cut you off.
No, you didn't cut me off. I was just jumping in because in this text, what's beautiful about it, it reminds us of how difficult it is sometimes to be placed in a variety of different positions. How much was Joseph's kind of, haughtiness or whatever term you want to use was due to Jacob's need to splash this attention all over him? What was going on if, Jacob being, if I remember, the youngest, the younger brother, saw in him something of himself. And Jacob's journey is told later, early on, of his fear of his older brothers and everything like that, and God's guidance, and how much was Jacob, intimately involved in this painful situation for Joseph as a young child who had gifts. Obviously, he had gifts, and didn't have, as we said, the maturity to kind of be able to manage these gifts. And to have the special coat above, his brothers. It's just fascinating how human and telling this story is, but it also spins a story of God's presence in the ups and downs of the story.
Yeah. It would be helpful to remember that we're dealing with a blended family, not of two, but of four families blended together, because Jacob had 4 different wives and kids by all 4 of them.
Do you think it makes a difference if the family is blended?
The inclination to favoritism is heightened by that, is my perception. It is often my kids, you don't discipline my kids, I discipline my kids. Those kind of things come into play. And so Joseph, being the firstborn son of Jacob's true love, Rachel, gets the love that he had for Rachel transferred down to him.
Because Rachel had passed away through childbirth with Benjamin by this time. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. And Rachel was the one he wanted from the beginning, and he ended up with Leah.
And I would guess that relationship process didn't start just because Rachel died. That was long entrenched in the family.
No doubt. Youngest and oldest, absolutely.
Absolutely. And living out of how my issues affects the way I treat one of the boys. All of those dynamics are at play in this story.
So
But
Is
Yes,
this
but-
the model we want to use as a biblical family?
I don't know that I think for me, the best thing about this story is not whether or not it's the model I want to use, but more that it represents a truth about human families for me.
Yeah, I was being sarcastic
Oh, got it.
in our political environment. Sorry.
Oh, so I should have been thinking. And the other thing I thought was super interesting about this, and I don't know if you guys have thinking about it. Now, because the narrative lectionary starts off with Genesis, that the word they use about how Joseph does he is he indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us? Which I think is a super interesting word.
Power over.
See, that's interesting because I always think of dominion as different from domination. That when humankind was given dominion over the earth, it meant not only did we have this kind of position of charge, but also we were charged with care.
Yeah.
And that went both ways. And I think it's interesting because I think to some extent it foreshadows what'll happen at the end.
Yeah.
That exactly what the brothers don't want, which is Joseph to be in charge, is seen in how he cares for them at the end of the story. Now,
Right.
granted took them a long time to get there, but that's
The
just
irony is that Joseph was in charge from the beginning because Jacob's world revolved around him. And so in doing so, there was a sense in which he dominated the scene. Everything revolved around Jacob's love for Joseph. Joseph was in charge emotionally in that system.
Yeah, love. Or maybe even his fear for Joseph. And I'm not excluding love, but I mean, Jacob had his own story
Yeah.
and the
That
fear
he
that
brought
he
with him.
felt as a youngest and really vulnerable within that family system of his. So I think that love matched with his anxiety about what would happen to Joseph after he was gone, because we know the hierarchy of, oldest males over younger males and the division of, the father's, we would say, assets. But, in some ways, Joseph was vulnerable in the
Yeah.
midst of all that. And especially with much older brothers.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how this idea of journey of maturity, I think, probably again reading it, where does he get assigned? It gets assigned to Joseph. Joseph grew up and now he's okay. But I think the end verses show a really interesting reversal. The brothers who were like, what do you think? You have a reign over us, you have dominion over us, are the ones who get down and say,
Yeah, we'll be your slaves.
yeah.
Mm.
So exactly what's being taught, exactly what everybody thinks they don't want. And I'd have to think about it. I don't know that there's evidence either way that includes Joseph. But I don't know that Joseph is out there actively trying to be mean. I mean, I think he comes off as snotty, and that comes from somebody who's ascribed that to others.
Mm-hmm.
But I just feel like it is interesting to me this reversal. That Joseph in the end, it seems to me, presents himself in a way that is more humble, and his brothers do as well, and that shifts the
power dynamic. The power dynamic at the end is different. When Joseph comes to the brothers in the field, they have the power and he is the vulnerable one. The only thing that is protecting him is his father's love for him or his father's priority of him. But when they get to Egypt, Joseph is in the position of power and they are the vulnerable ones.
So I wonder if you have, I know we're getting close to our time,
Yep.
a sense of, so how's this story, the cycle of story, this particular branch of the Abraham story play out in terms of why include this? What is in the writer's mindset of this, of putting together these stories about the patriarchs later? So what's that about, you think, in terms of why tell the story the way he told the story?
That's a super interesting question.
Of course, the Joseph story sets up the experience of bondage in Egypt. But why he told, I guess he told that here's how they got there. I don't know.
I think it's a here's how they got their story, but I also wonder if it isn't to some extent well, I don't know. See, I automatically connect it up the family tree,
Mhm.
you know, that I'm thinking about the previous reading from the narrative lectionary, was God describing the promise to Abraham, as many as stars in the sky. And this to some extent captures, and in the Abraham story, there's this sense that is God still at work here when we can't see what God is doing?
Yeah.
This Genesis story says, yes, God is still at work here, even when we can't see what God is doing, but it shows us how the story ends in this particular moment among these brothers.
It shows us how God redeems all of this brokenness and the lack of relationship among those brothers, that God is able to work in spite of it.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, the subtle thing that rings through that whole Genesis story is that God really is a rule breaker in terms of, the priority is on the oldest. And
Yep.
yet each one, the oldest takes on, in many ways, the oldest loses.
Jacob and Esau. God chose
Yeah.
Jacob, not Esau.
Yeah.
Even in,
go ahead, Steve.
sorry, even in the 12 sons of Israel, Jacob's 12 sons, the oldest didn't get it. Judah became the lion. And Joseph was the special one, the chosen one.
Yeah.
That God used to get him into Egypt. Yeah.
So it is, I think that probably is not the main thing in the story, but I find it interesting that God kind of turns the stories upside, the culture upside down, and says that God will bless who God blesses.
Yep. Yep.
And
God doesn't follow the social norms.
Yeah. There's always room. And I think that plays out. It always is room for the weak and vulnerable. God does not exclude them, and God exalts them. Magnificat with Mary.
Yeah.
So there is this thing within the story that reverberates almost as a countermeasure to the way things are.
It's almost as though God opposes the power position and exalts those who do not have it. It gives it to them.
I'm going to have to think more about that, because I also think that God regularly works with whatever God has. But
thankfully with us.
Yeah. Super conversation. We are at the end of our time. Steve, would you be willing to pray us out?
Sure. So let's pray together. And so once again, merciful and gracious God, we are reminded that your ways are not our ways, that you relate to us out of your grace, and that you are faithful to us, and that even in the midst of our humanness and our brokenness, that you work for our good. And yea, you even use us for good. So we thank you for who you are as we give ourselves to you again and say, continue your marvelous work in us and through us. For that is our prayer in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Peace, friends.
Peace.
The peace of Christ